On the morning of April 27, 1988, exactly 2 years to the day after the Chernobyl reactor exploded, Valery Legasov walked into his apartment, sat down, and recorded the last of several cassette tapes he had been making in secret over the preceding months. Then he went to his study and hanged himself. He was 51 years old. The tapes were hidden. The Soviet authorities, who had been watching Legasov with the particular attention reserved for men who know too much, did not find them immediately. But copies had been made, and those copies survived. And what was on them? A detailed, unflinching account of everything that had happened at Chernobyl, everything the Soviet system had done wrong, and everything that the powerful men who ran that system had tried to conceal eventually reached the world. Legasov had known when he made those recordings that he was dying. The radiation he had absorbed during his months at Chernobyl had done its work quietly and thoroughly, the way radiation always does. He had headaches, he had trouble sleeping. His body was failing in the small, persistent ways that told him the end was not far. He could have spent whatever time remained to him in the way that dying men sometimes do, quietly, privately, making peace. Instead, he spent it talking into a tape recorder, making sure the truth would outlast him. This is who Valery Legasov was. He had been, before Chernobyl, one of the most distinguished scientists in the Soviet Union, a chemist, a member of the prestigious Soviet Academy of Sciences, a man whose career had been built on decades of careful, brilliant work in the field of inorganic chemistry. He was not a dissident. He was not a rebel. He was, in many ways, a loyal son of the Soviet system, a man who believed in the institutions he served and had been rewarded, in turn, with recognition and status and the comfortable life of a senior Soviet scientist. Then, on April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. The explosion was the result of a catastrophically flawed reactor design, combined with a series of decisions made by poorly trained operators working under a culture of secrecy and institutional dishonesty so pervasive that the people responsible for the plant did not fully understand the machine they were running. The reactor, a model called the RBMK, had a design flaw so dangerous that the people who knew about it had classified the information, buried it in documents that the operators at Chernobyl never saw, never read, never knew existed. When the conditions for catastrophe aligned on the night of April 25th and 26th, the men in the control room had no idea what was about to happen. They made the decisions that made sense given what they knew. What they knew was not enough. Legasov was called to Moscow's government commission on Chernobyl within hours of the explosion. He had not slept. He barely had time to understand what had happened before he was on a plane to Ukraine, flying toward the burning reactor, toward a situation that no one fully understood and no one knew how to manage. What he found when he arrived was chaos organized to look like control. Local officials were giving reassuring statements to a public that had not yet been evacuated. The reactor was still burning, not a conventional fire, but a nuclear inferno, sending radioactive particles into the atmosphere at a rate that Legasov, running the calculations in his head, understood would contaminate much of Europe if it was not stopped. The graphite moderator at the core of the reactor was on fire. Nobody knew how to put it out. Legasov knew. The solution he developed. smothering the burning core with a mixture of boron, sand, clay, and lead delivered by helicopter, was improvised under conditions of extreme pressure and imperfect information. It was not a clean solution. It was not a solution from a textbook. It was the solution of a brilliant man working with what he had, under a deadline measured not in days, but in hours, with the lives of millions of people as the stakes. The helicopters flew directly over the burning reactor, their crews absorbing enormous doses of radiation with each pass. The pilots and crew members who flew those missions knew what they were flying into. They flew anyway. And the mixture worked. Slowly, imperfectly, but it worked. The burning core was suppressed. The worst-case scenarios that Legasov had been calculating, the ones where the fire burned through the floor of the reactor building and hit the water table and produced a steam explosion that would render much of Europe uninhabitable for decades, did not come to pass. But the fight was not over. The reactor site was still lethally radioactive. The surrounding area, including the city of Pripyat, home to nearly 50,000 people, had to be evacuated. A zone of exclusion had to be established and enforced. A sarcophagus of steel and concrete had to be built over the destroyed reactor to contain what remained. All of this required decisions and resources and the kind of honest assessment of the situation that the Soviet system was structurally incapable of providing. This was where Legasov's real battle began. The Soviet system ran on a particular kind of institutional lie, not crude propaganda necessarily, but the systematic denial of bad news, the reflexive tendency to report upward what superiors wanted to hear rather than what was actually true. This tendency had, in a very direct sense, caused Chernobyl. The design flaw in the RBMK reactor had been known and suppressed because acknowledging it would have been politically inconvenient. Now, in the aftermath of the disaster, the same system was trying to manage the story of what had happened in the same way, minimizing, obscuring, controlling. Legasov would not cooperate. At the International Atomic Energy Agency conference in Vienna in August of 1986, where the Soviet Union was required to give an account of the Chernobyl disaster to the international scientific community, Legasov delivered a presentation of devastating honesty. For 5 hours, speaking without notes, he laid out in precise technical detail exactly what had happened, exactly what had gone wrong, and exactly what the consequences were. The Western scientists in the audience, who had expected the usual Soviet performance of reassurance and deflection, were stunned. It was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable acts of institutional courage in the history of the Cold War. He paid for it. When Legasov returned to Moscow, the political establishment that he had embarrassed with his honesty made its displeasure known in the quiet, effective ways available to Soviet bureaucracies. He was passed over for awards he had been promised. His recommendations for reactor safety improvements were ignored. His colleagues, who understood which way the wind was blowing, began to distance themselves. The man who had saved Europe found himself increasingly isolated in the institution he had served his entire career. And the radiation was doing its work. By 1987, Legasov had attempted suicide once already, a fact carefully concealed from his colleagues and superiors. He was in physical decline and psychological darkness, caught between what he knew and what he was permitted to say, between the truth he had told in Vienna and the lies the system continued to require him at home.
He felt by his own account on those final tapes that he had not done enough, that there was more to say, that the whole story had not been told. The tapes he made in his final months were his answer to that feeling. They were addressed to no one in particular and to everyone, to future scientists, to the Soviet leadership that had failed so catastrophically, to history itself. In them, he described the design flaws in Soviet reactors in detail that the authorities had never publicly acknowledged. He described the culture of dishonesty that had made Chernobyl inevitable. He described what needed to change. He spoke with the clarity of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything left to say. He died on April 27, 1988. The tapes surfaced. The Soviet Union, which had 3 years left to exist, could not entirely suppress them. Glasnost, Gorbachev's policy of openness, was already making the old methods of information control less effective. Fragments of what Legasov had recorded began to circulate. His name, which the establishment had tried to quietly erase, refused to disappear. In 1996, 8 years after his death, Legasov was awarded the title Hero of the Russian Federation by Boris Yeltsin, the highest honor the post-Soviet state could bestow. It was a recognition, however belated, that what he had done at Chernobyl and after it had mattered, that the truth he had insisted on telling, at the cost of his career and ultimately his life, had been worth telling. He walked into the fire knowing it would kill him. He told the truth, knowing it would cost him everything. And when he had nothing left, no health, no standing, no future, he sat down with a tape recorder and made sure the truth would survive him. That is what Valery Legasov was. Not a hero in the comfortable sense, not a man who acted without fear or doubt or the full knowledge of what his choices would cost him, but a man who acted anyway, who looked at what was true and what was right and chose them again and again until he could choose no more. The reactor he helped contain still sits inside its sarcophagus in northern Ukraine. The exclusion zone around it will not be safe for human habitation for another 20,000 years, and Valery Legasov is buried in Moscow, in a grave that is visited by people who understand what he gave so that they could be standing there, alive, to visit it.